17th of February 2006, at least I think it is, and we're here at Teachers College, Columbia University, and we're interviewing Professor Betty Reardon as part of our Parents of the Field project about the early years of the peace research and peace studies movement, and we are, as usual, delighted to be here and happy that you can come and talk to us and tell us about how the field got started. Looking back now, in the early days of the peace and conflict studies field, people came into it from all sorts of different backgrounds, disciplines, etc., interests. Now, so what was yours? How did you get into the field?
I got involved in the field as a field, and I think it is a field. It's not a discipline. As a consequence of some of the things I did as a teacher in a private school in Westchester. Mm-hmm. I had developed what turned out to be a kind of groundbreaking program in teaching world issues. Mm-hmm. And I was working with a little foundation that supported such programs, and we received a request to fund an international program. Mm-hmm. In what was then called, I think, World Order Studies. Mm-hmm. So I was asked to come to an institute that still exists in a different form, called the Institute for World Order, to develop and direct a schools program. Mm-hmm. For the Institute to formulate curriculum, educate teachers so that the issues could be brought into the schools.
Okay. So was there something that particularly attracted you to working in this kind of a field?
Yeah, I think from the time of being a child in the Second World War and what seemed to me the complete folly of the enterprise, I had an interest in issues of war and peace, and I had some interest in things such as the World Federalist Movement, mm-hmm. various initiatives for international cooperation. Mm. And I had been following the UN from San Francisco as a teenager. Mm-hmm. I had been taken to visit the UN at Flushing Meadow before the headquarters were mm-hmm. built by my social studies teacher in high school. So it was an area that worked its way into my teaching, and then as a consequence of being able to do some rather unusual things, I was asked to come to do, and it looked to me like an opportunity to have other teachers doing what I thought they should be doing, which wasn't exactly what I was doing, but at least raising the issues and preparing people to think about them as responsible citizens. Okay.
So about when was this that you made the
Well, I started full-time with the Institute in 1963. Mm-hmm. And I was there until 1976 or something like that. So I worked with the project for 13 years, during which time a number of developments took place, both in my area of the field, peace education, and in the field that we relate to. I think of the field as what I call it peace knowledge. And it's peace research, peace studies, which is not exclusively, but draws largely on peace research to create university studies. And peace education, which is not just what happens in schools, but it is a whole field which devotes itself to pedagogy, and that is what are the ways that people need to be able to think about certain problems in a constructive way that can move them outside of the paradigms of thinking that have apparently kept us trapped in the war system for all these years.
Okay.
So,
can you give us an example of the kind of parameter shift that you're talking about? A shift in
well,
thinking?
one thing is, and I learned to use this in my years at the Institute for World Order, is to look at issues within a systems context, and not just holistic or globally, you know, like the jargon goes, but to look not only at the multiple factors that influence any issue or problem, but also the system in which that problem emerges, the components of the system, what it's supposed to be able to do and what it can and can't do and why not, and what might be alternatives either to components of the system or to the entire system. So we've done that most of all with the way in which we study security issues, but it has relevance to other aspects. But we have, and I've been working on this more in the past 20 years, the specification of the pedagogy, developed different processes for different issues, not so much issues of fields of concern. So, and we train teachers in it and create university curricula. In 1963, reactions from the general educational establishment was, well, this is a project of idealism, and it would be nice to do that if we had a little room in the program and so forth, but no need to pay much attention. However, there were a lot of teachers who were paying attention, and I was able to work with many of them on the creation of materials and so forth that then began to catch on. But the ability of the teachers to use that material and to raise these issues was very much compromised. The problem was that when the resistance from the establishment came to the field of peace education, they were reacting to a preconceived notion of what peace education was. They never looked at what we did because we bent over backwards not to be advocates, but to have an open inquiry and to try to get people to think in terms of alternatives and to think critically. But if you said peace, it was very, very threatening. And what happened was a lot of people took cover in something called global education. Because global education came to mean for a lot of people, we are going to educate a generation for global power. You know, now, there are a lot of people who have practiced global education that mean global justice and cooperation and so forth, but that wasn't what was the underlying purpose of a number of projects that were called global education. So, but it brought into the field new issues that weren't apparent when the focus was primarily on the arms race and the nature of conflict at the higher level of the system. So it helped us, and again using this kind of systems perspective, to inquire into how conflicts were emerging out of historic conditions, colonialism, and relating to the larger conflict. And I think that was a very important development. But it took a while for that to really become the way people looked at Vietnam, because the teachers who were able to bring it into their classrooms just did very traditional stuff, pro or con the war. You know, it was like the teach-ins, which were very good, but they were, you know, somebody gets up and defends the policy and somebody else criticizes it, and it never produces very much, except some people in the audience will go one way or the other. And it did convince university students that they wanted to have peace studies, however.
So you think that the field, in a paradoxical way, benefited from that debate of that time?
Yeah, I think to some degree it did. However, the underlying problems were there, whether we had had the Vietnam War or not, and if there was a legitimate scholarship, it would have found its way into this area. And I think we would have had peace studies, and I hope peace education as well.
So, peace studies, peace education, conflict studies, conflict resolution. Did you see any distinction at all between all of these various labels, or were they?
Yeah, definitely.
What
Well,
struck you?
The basic field that I come from, substantively, is peace research, and there is, of course, the conflict strand in peace research, but it's not the only area of inquiry. And peace studies drew very heavily on the arms race issues, conflict, but also on some of the normative elements that were being brought into the field, largely, I think, in the United States as a result of the civil rights movement, which brought focus to active nonviolence as a political strategy. So there were universities that did have courses in nonviolence as well as conflict, war, peace. Very often it was couched in terms of issues of war and peace, or peace and conflict, almost as if they were, opposites rather than on a continuum and interrelated. So the distinction between peace research and peace studies is that the peace studies is curricular in nature. The field of peace education, as I said, goes to to the pedagogy, and peace education draws on all the fields, and it had been affected as the field of peace research had been, as the whole area of positive peace emerged, and issues of development, human rights, issues of structural violence became the subject of research. That also entered into peace studies and peace education. But you can't do conflict resolution only and say it's peace education. You can't do human rights, in the area of calling it positive peace and say that's peace education. Because peace education requires a kind of comprehensive view, because the citizen has to be educated about human rights, about development issues, about security, about conflict. So when people say, oh, it doesn't matter what you do, if you do this one or that one. Well, it doesn't matter where you start. It doesn't matter what the entryway is. But ultimately, if it is going to be peace education in the way that we've defined it, people that I work with, it has to be comprehensive and recognize that these are distinct fields, and have been from the very beginning.
What were some of the important connections that you made in these early days that sort of helped to get the whole thing started? Conferences, organizations, and who were important people that influenced you and helped to develop the field of peace education at this particular point in time, particularly?
Well, the standards, but also I was very much influenced by the people in the institute where I worked, and their enterprise called the World Order Models Project.
Oh, WOMP, yes.
Yeah. So, I listened to and read the work that Falk and Menlowitz did, and was involved in a lot of their conversations and so forth. Kotari from India, Gustavo Lagos from Chile, Jean Gerasimov, who was then from the Soviet Union, Johann Galtung, and very much by Kenneth and Elise Bolden. And I always appreciated very much that Elise saw that education was another field, and it was equally as important to the whole enterprise of peace knowledge. And she was very instrumental in opening the minds of researchers and peace studies people to the significance and urgency of peace education, because they weren't convinced that it was at all relevant to what they were doing. Of course, most the peace research conferences were in Europe. And the Peace Education Commission of IPRA was founded not until 1972, but at the IPRA meeting in Bled.
In Yugoslavia, yes. As it then was, of course. Did any of the other sort of traditional disciplinary conferences help at this point? I mean, you talked about going to educational conferences, but this is well before the National Conference on Peace and Conflict Resolution, but I remember going to some conferences with the International Political Psychology Association, for example, that were very interesting and very helpful. But were there any, when you were starting out, that were interested in peace education and wanted to push it?
No, they weren't interested, but I was interested in what they were doing as an arena in which to learn. So I used to go quite regularly to American Society of International Law, was that?
Oh, yes, that's one.
And sit in the back of the room and absorb it all as much as I could. And
but you're a teacher, not a lawyer.
That's right, but you have to know that stuff to teach what we teach. And the Political Science Association, the International Relations, you know, I did a lot of that because this is where the mainline thinking was, and that scholarship was influencing what was happening in the schools. And then there were a lot of people who were doing some wonderful groundbreaking work in those societies. I don't remember the particular names, you know, who aren't crossovers. But they helped, I think, to create a discourse between traditional disciplines and people who were doing peace research and peace studies. And that helped those of us who were educators to formulate our inquiries and to identify the kinds of problems that would be appropriate to build into curriculum.
Okay. So you stayed with the Institute until the early 70s?
I left there in 1976.
To come here?
No, I left. There was a kind of struggle. There's an intersection of hierarchies that women professionals, particularly women educators working with substantive people, deal with all the time. And one is that in the academic hierarchy, anybody dealing with schools is down about here, and then teachers are down about here. And then the other aspect is, and it was particularly strong in the 60s and 70s, that you uppity women can't really understand this stuff. And when you say you have another perspective, that's a very personal perspective on public issues, and so and so. Stuck in the middle. I came to Teachers College because Teachers College was host to an organization called the World Council of Curriculum Instruction. And for about 2 years or so, I served as executive director of this organization. So I came regularly to Teachers College, and one day a young woman walked into my office and said, "I'm a doctoral student in science education, and my professor is looking for you." So Professor Willard Jacobson, who was very well known internationally as a science educator, had become deeply concerned about the nuclear arms race. This was the early 80s. And he felt that something should be done as an educational response, because people were very ignorant about the nature of the weapons, their consequences, and about the politics of it.
They still are.
So, yeah. So anyway, he and I started talking about what could happen here. And we started with one seminar and gradually built and built. So.
And so it started with you and Professor Willard, and then the building consisted
actually, there were 3 of us at the beginning. Willard called a meeting of faculty to present this, and it was quite well attended. But when things really were shaken down, beside Willard and me, there was one other professor who was willing to put in a lot of extra time, and that was Douglas Sloan. So the 3 of us were co-teachers of the first seminar, and ultimately I had to take over all of it because they got overwhelmed with other things. But it made it possible because we had 2 respected, tenured professors, and that made all the difference.
Oh yes, it does, doesn't it? Yeah. So it's interesting that the person who acted as a gate opener or rainmaker or whatever was, mainly interested in physics and the nuclear problem. And one of the things that a lot of people have said about peace research, peace education, conflict research, is that it's always been very multidisciplinary and pulls ideas from a variety of places. And it seems that that's been your experience as well here, and in your previous work for the Institute, that it's not, we were talking earlier about whether it's a field or a discipline, and if it's anything, it's multidisciplinary and pulls from all sorts of different places.
Yeah.
Has that been something that you see as a major advantage in your experience, in your work, borrowing from everywhere?
Yeah, I think it is. I have my own particular take on this. I believe that people should be grounded in a discipline. I think that it gives you your first experience with systematic thinking about particular issues and substantive areas. But most of the problems that we deal with require knowledge and expertise from many disciplines, so that makes the multidisciplinarity an important part. But there has to be as well coming together to define the areas of inquiry, which I would call interdisciplinary.
Okay.
And then there is the point at which some people who are commonly concerned, who may or may not be from distinct disciplines, know that they have to draw on those. And I would say that in a way is transdisciplinary, because you just kind of go over the boundaries rather than recognizing and using them. But it is important because it represents some of the ways we have to begin to think, even though I still advocate that, particularly for undergraduates, they should have a traditional discipline grounding. That the kind of thinking we have to do and the way we have to think about the world isn't isn't something that can be learned through one discipline.
Yeah.
So that it is very important, I think, for our field to draw people who have a really firm discipline and who see the multi and inter and transdisciplinary possibilities and what that can contribute to building peace knowledge.
Okay. I think I agree with you, but give me an example of the way in which this ability to pull different ideas together has sort of helped you, particularly in your work.
Well,
could you do that?
I think, can I give you something more contemporary?
Yes,
as an
of course,
example?
yes. I mean, this is
For a couple of years, I've been working on a project called Ethical and Spiritual Foundations of Peace Education. Right. So in order to create an educational sequence which enables people who are not going to be specialists in any of these areas, to engage with ethics, religious aspects of peace questions, you have to bring in aspects of theology, ethics, political science in the sense of analyses of interreligious conflicts, human rights, because these offer standards for determining what is a transcultural ethic and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And I think it works with virtually everything we do in a way. We study of development issues and poverty also calls, you have to look at structural issues, political questions, economy, culture. I think, for example, young people who have studied aspects of economic structures in peace studies programs and who have, as part of their studies, gone to developing, I don't know what word you should use, but Galton peripheral countries, have been able to see things in a way that they would not if they had just done international relations and read the newspaper. And I think to be very effective as catalysts for bringing some change when they work on projects and things of that kind. I believe that knowledge from peace studies has to some degree affected the larger peace movement, but not enough. I think there's still a little gap between the activists and the academics. Academics are activists, but some of them are not. And there are problems too, because you have problems of how you are no longer perceived as an objective scholar, maybe. And certainly I don't believe that you should bring your activism or your views as an activist into the classroom. So in that way, I think the applied is somewhat limited. But where it should be useful is at levels of policy making, national, state, I'm talking about this country, and which it virtually doesn't exist, except if someone gets into elected office who happens to know somebody who has this background. Jim used to talk politics, and others have as well. But then when you look at the McNeil-Lehrer report, and who do they bring in for the professorial pundit. They're mainline thinkers who are straight within the present paradigm and talk that game and don't stimulate any different thinking or anything that can really impact that much on policy. I think there are many factors that feed into not being effective, and I don't think it's all laid at the door of the field or the researchers. I believe that many policy makers don't know or care that there is a field of peace research. I think that most policy makers do not think in terms that would enable them to welcome, much less fully understand, the products of peace research. And if they did understand it, they probably would be very fearful of a lot of it because critical peace research is research that looks to critically analyze the sources of problems, which would mean profound changes in the way things are done, and maybe even in the people that do it, which policymakers would not welcome. That's one aspect. The other aspect, and that's just kind of quick and dirty on that.
No, that's fine.
The other aspect is the field itself and the way it articulates itself. It is an academic field, and academics tend to articulate to other academics. And they have little concern with making themselves fully comprehensible to those who are not initiated. And if the average intelligent citizen hasn't got an idea articulated in a form that she or he can consider within their frames of reference, then it's not going to have any impact. And I don't think that this means that peace research has to give up its jargon or whatever. But they have to acknowledge that the form in which they put their product out is not going to hit the newsstands. You know. So, and I think there is a field there for the popularization of peace research.